Welcome to Just Healing, where we rediscover humanity and our conversations around trauma and celebrate all the unique ways we love and heal. I'm one of your Season 2 co-hosts, Michael Munson. Trauma doesn't exist in a bubble, and healing shouldn't either. Let's listen, let's learn, let's heal.
I think there's some baseline things that most people would recognize as messages that most people in the US get about what it means to be a man. And a lot of those things have to do with being strong, being able to protect oneself and one's family. The same messages fuel men's violence toward women are the messages that also tell men who are victims that their experience isn't real. All of those things either directly or indirectly communicate that men can't be victims and survivors of sexual harm. That really stops men from getting help in the aftermath of these things that are happening, regardless of whether or not we want to recognize that they are.
Hey everyone, welcome to the next episode of Just Healing. I'm Michael Munson, one of your Season 2 co-hosts. This podcast series is really fun for me on a personal level because I get to talk with people that I've known for a really long time and who I respect and who have really, great things to say and share with everybody. So today we are joined with Louie Marven, who works at the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, or NSVRC, which can be a mouthful, but those of us who have worked with NSVRC have it really down on our tongues and know how to go with it. So Louie, I'm wondering if you could share with us a little bit about who we are. I mean, we've known each other for a while, but I'm wondering if you could share about what NSVRC is, what and who you are, and anything that you want to share about us, for the people that are listening.
Yeah, thanks, Michael, for having me. I'm glad to be talking with you today. And NSVRC is a division of Respect Together, and we're headquartered here in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, which is also where I live. And the other main division of Respect Together is the Pennsylvania Coalition to Advance Respect. So that's our anti-sexual assault coalition here in Pennsylvania. And my role here at NSVRC is project coordinator, and I support a number of our projects that are about supporting the anti-violence field on preventing and responding to sexual violence. And the main part of my work here is to manage a training and technical assistance initiative grant from the Office on Violence Against Women, or OVW. And that's about services for male survivors of sexual assault. So that's a bit of jargon, but what that actually means is that I work with our team here at NSVRC to create resources and to offer training and to provide support and answer questions for those people and organizations who are working with men who are survivors of sexual violence, or who would like to be, but maybe aren't seeing men at their programs. And just something else about me is that before I worked here, I worked in the LGBTQ movement for about a decade in various roles at our local LGBT community center here in central Pennsylvania, including as the executive director of that organization. And we knew each other a little bit then when I was doing that work. So yeah, it's again, it's good to be talking with you today, Michael.
That's great. Yeah, and I was thinking about that before we started today. I was thinking, like, when did we first meet? How did we first meet? And I was thinking that Forge, the organization that I work for, we did a photo shoot at the LGBT Center where you were the executive director, and it was really a lovely experience to do that. So yeah, it's kind of neat that we've kind of known each other through some different iterations.
Yeah.
I know that I will try at least to not use a lot of those acronyms because you and I are really familiar with them, but I know that our listeners are not, familiar with OBC, OBW, TTA, NSVRC. So, so please stop me if I use some of those abbreviations and that don't make sense for folks. And that kind of leads us to the folks that are listening today. may have lots of different relationships with men, with males, with male identified folks who have experienced sexual harm. So they might be survivors themselves. They may love somebody who's a survivor. They might be a service provider. And we all have kind of our own like headspace or knowledge about what we think about as sexual violence or sexual harm or sexual abuse. And I'm wondering if a good place to start is, how do you define sexual violence or sexual harm? And that's like a huge question. So whatever you want to add to that about what's your definition?
Yeah. So, I'll start with kind of, what we say at the National Sexual Violence Resource Center about what sexual violence is, which is any type of unwanted sexual contact, which can include words and actions of a sexual nature against a person's will and without their consent. And something that we do here in terms of communicating with the general public and even within our own field is that, to help illustrate the range of behaviors that encompass sexual violence, you'll see us using language like sexual abuse, harassment, and assault. And we found that language like that really helps listeners, imagine this continuum, this range of behaviors that we're talking about that include sexual violence. And of course, sexual violence happens in every community and affects people of all genders and ages. And, from my vantage point in the field, I noticed that it's very important to be able to define the services that we offer after sexual violence as going beyond an immediate crisis response. So I think we tend to be quick to think of those very important crisis responses like a forensic exam or making a report or receiving individual counseling and advocacy in the immediate aftermath of an assault. Very important services. But we also need to also offer services and communicate about those services that support survivors across the lifespan. So I think about like adult survivors of child sexual abuse as one example. And just sexual assault centers are there for people who, for another example, are having nightmares related to sexual abuse years after the abuse happened. So in that circumstance, someone is maybe not looking for an immediate crisis response type of service, but that person is a survivor who deserves those free and confidential services that sexual assault centers in local communities offer. So, that's certainly relevant for survivors of all genders. But I do think it's particularly relevant for men who are more likely to wait years to disclose sexual abuse. Again, that's not something that is specific to men, but that is particularly relevant when we're talking about men.
Yeah, exactly. And like you said, it's like, it's not specific to men that, may not disclose or may not need or want services right away. But yeah, we need to support people not just in that moment of crisis, but 20 years later or 40 years later. And one of the things that you said, which I think is so important, is that like, how you describe things as you talk about, I think you said abuse, harassment, and assault. And those are all words that mean different things to people or feel different things to people. And I know like with Men Healing often talks about sexual harm. So as another one of those words in that series, because sometimes people don't relate to the words assault or harassment, because sometimes they're gendered in that kind of the way people think about those words. So I appreciate the list that you have. And then there's also some other words that people might use that are still part of that same equations, the same stuff. Yeah. Can we talk a little bit about culture? So we live in this culture that kind of tells us that it's wrong to be a lot of different things. So like men get told, you can't be sexually assaulted. And we live in this culture that tells us that it's not okay to be a certain religion or a certain race or a certain gender, or a certain sexual orientation. All of those, there's lots and lots of different things that we're told that are not okay. And so there's these like pervasive messages about you shouldn't be whatever it is. And that sometimes translates to what happened to you wasn't real, or you're not supposed to be believed. Or if you're a survivor, we're going to fix you. Or if you're a gay person, we're going to fix you. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about um, how that relates to men and sexual harm, because it is related. So I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about the culture and the cultural messages that impact us all. So especially around men and masculine folks. For example, the other day we talked about um, how some religions say that you don't own your body, you don't have control over your body, or how conversion therapy is still really prominent in our culture. So any of those kinds of things about like how does our culture influence men and male survivors?
Yeah, so many different directions that I want to try to
Mhm.
go and address all the different things that you were talking about, Michael. So yeah, I mean, I think there's some kind of baseline things that most people would recognize as messages that most people in the US get about what it means to be a man. And a lot of those things have to do with, being strong, being able to protect oneself and one's family, and not being a victim, not asking for help. And so, all of those things um, either directly or indirectly communicate that men can't be victims and survivors of sexual harm, of 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 sexual violence in any of the ways that that we might define sexual violence, and so that really stops men from getting help in the aftermath of these things that are happening, regardless of whether or not we want to recognize that they are. Um, so I think that's one way that um, that culture is relevant to this conversation. It's kind of a basic way. Um, and I don't know, in this project, something that we try to emphasize is that when we are when we are conscious of how sexual violence is impacting men, or men are experiencing sexual violence, um, that's not kind of a separate thing from working with women or from working with survivors of all genders. We can still know that there are men who are using violence against others. Um, but we there's this kind of common thing in terms of like it's the same messages that we're kind of working against when we say that men experience sexual violence and deserve access to those services that are available for healing at sexual assault centers. Um, those same kinds of messages are are challenging those kind of dominant cultural messages we get about who men are and who women are, and maybe that's it, right? Because in that paradigm, there are only men and women. So I think that, yeah, the same messages that fuel men's violence toward women, for example, are the messages that also tell men who are victims that, your experience isn't real, and that you shouldn't get access to services in response to those. So I think that's really important to kind of frame the issue um, as connected, that like working with men isn't kind of a separate out there activity, working with men as survivors. And yeah, I love that you picked up on the religion thing. This is um, this is something that I really like to talk about because I grew up in slash adjacent to um, communities where I got these messages in faith communities, and in how these messages kind of leaked out into the the dominant culture. But this idea that, yeah, our bodies don't belong to us, and um, and I think that that is some really high level grooming, in fact, whether intentionally or not, that that happens in some faith communities, where this message that our body belongs to a higher being or something like that also says our bodies don't belong to us, so we don't. It kind of implies directly or indirectly that we don't get to control, um, you know, what happens to our bodies, or that we might not be the ones who are in fact in charge of getting to say, yes and no, or give consent to our bodies, and how our bodies are interacting with other bodies, for example. Yeah, and then you also mentioned conversion therapy, or so-called conversion therapy, and I just think that's an untapped topic for the anti-sexual violence field. I think that attempts to tell LGBTQ people that we aren't who we are, or we should change who we are, and that's even possible, which is what conversion therapy says that it does or seeks to do. I think that is sexual harassment. I think that we can categorize the actual practice of that, or even the culture that supports saying that is, a good or real thing to pursue. I think we can call that sexual harassment, and that people who have been part of communities where those messages or those practices have been pervasive deserve space to heal. And that sexual sexual harassment, and people who've experienced sexual harassment can get services at sexual assault centers. So I think that is an area where people should be advocates in our movement, should be prepared to work with survivors on. I wouldn't say just go ahead and say that you're doing this now. Like, there are probably good partnerships to have in place in terms of local LGBTQ services, and to make sure that you might be more aware of the issues and the impacts of this type of practice. But I always think that's an interesting avenue for providing services and healing.
Yeah, and it's interesting when I hear you talk about, like, when you were mentioning the things about religion and who owns people's bodies. I think so often times in our culture we think that that's like a women's thing, and we don't think about it affecting men or masculine folks. So I really appreciate you bringing it up, because I think sometimes in our culture we think, well, yeah, we kind of know that some religions do that, or some people believe that, but that's not about men. That's just about women. And the other thing that I was thinking about when you were talking about, conversion therapy, I was thinking that, like, sometimes parents of kids, like under 18, think that their kid might be gay if their kid experienced sexual violence or sexual harm with, another man or another, boy. So I was thinking, like, how that can be part of that process too. So, like, the kid might not be gay and going to, the so-called conversion therapy because they're gay, but because their parents think that they might be gay because they were sexually assaulted by a man. So I don't know if you have thoughts about that, because I know we've talked about kind of that whole, like, am I gay because I was assaulted by a man, and some of those common myths that happen.
There's a lot of confusion that that sexual violence can cause, for a victim. One of those is this thing of somebody wondering if they were assaulted by a man, what that means about their own identity. And that's really challenging. I definitely know gay men who are gay and had to struggle with, processing, is the assault that I experienced the thing that made me this way? Which of course it isn't, but that could take work to really know that. I do think that this is an interesting thing for us to be able to respond to. Sometimes we think of this topic as kind of something we don't want to talk about because it comes from myths, and it's false information, but it also is something that people who are survivors do struggle with. So we need to be able to think about it in that context too, as not just like, don't talk about that because it's spreading false information, but thinking about, if we're talking with a survivor who might be struggling with that question, like, that's a real thing, and we need to be able to work on that. And of course, one of the myths that's part of this is connected to just like physical responses to sexual interaction, even if that interaction is non-consensual, or you know, an assault. So for some people, you know, who have a penis, for example, getting an erection is sort of a natural response to, it's like a bodily response, right, to
Yeah.
certain kinds of touch or, but that can be confusing. Somebody might think, well, I reacted this way. That must have meant that I was enjoying the contact that was happening, and that's not necessarily true. So I think that's really connected to, like, if my body responded this way, does that mean I liked it? Does that mean that I liked being with a man? Does that mean that I, what does that mean for my identity? So I think, being able to work with someone to confirm that, no, this is one thing that a body does. That doesn't mean that, that doesn't imply consent. That doesn't imply anything about your identity. It just is one way that your body responded to this interaction. So I think that's an important myth to challenge directly as well.
Thank you for going there, because I think that it's a complex issue sometimes when the question comes up a lot, right? Of, did this make me gay? And so, like, that's what somebody might be questioning themselves if they're a survivor, but it's also a myth that society has and the victim service providers have. And like you brought up, people's bodies have responses to being touched or being in certain situations. And that is a normal response. And it doesn't mean that you're consenting to what's happening. So that can be really confusing for folks.
I've heard the thing of like an onion, right? When you cut an onion, have you cried, and does that mean that you were sad? And right. No, it was because of a bodily response to a particular stimulus. It doesn't imply something that you were feeling necessarily. You might also be sad. I don't know. But
that's a great example.
Yeah, people like that example. I think that's a good one. Yeah.
It is. Yeah. Let's shift gears a little bit. And you brought up some concepts about this already. So, as a kid, I grew up with a like really feminist oriented mom, and I grew up with a lot of feminist beliefs. And I know feminism sometimes gets a bad rap for lots of different reasons, but I used to kind of cringe at the concept or the language of like toxic masculinity. And I think that part of it was me understanding what my own masculinity was or my own femininity was. But there's a lot of power in those words. So I guess, for me, as I'm thinking about the language of toxic masculinity, it's something that I think we need to talk about. And it doesn't mean it's not victim blaming for men. But we live in this culture of toxic masculinity, of patriarchy, of places where genders are not considered equal. So I'm wondering if you want to share a little bit about what some of those social norms are, and then how that relates to the truths about sexual violence. How language can help us feel more empowered or disempowered. If a man is a survivor and they hear toxic masculinity, does that invalidate their survivorship? Those kinds of concepts. Like, how do those things go together?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I don't know that I have the answer, but I do have some thoughts. And I recognize that there are all kinds of different feminisms, and yeah, this term, like, personally has never really been challenging for me because I understand it to be, descriptive of an aspect or a type of masculinity. But I get it. Like, what you're describing, I think, is really or you described it in two different ways why it could be challenging when reflecting on one's own masculinity and thinking about what it means and how to make sense of it, and then also how to connect the concept of toxic masculinity with also being a survivor of sexual abuse. I really think that you also mentioned the word patriarchy. I really think that a lot of the issues here can be solved by describing what we're talking about or using plain language instead of jargon. And so I don't I don't know that that's going to solve the issue, but if labeling is the hang up for people, just being able to like put it in a sentence. So instead of using the label of toxic masculinity, saying like the messages that we get that say that men shouldn't ask for help, or that men can't be victims, or whatever the thing about toxic masculinity is that you're trying to communicate. I always think that putting the label in a descriptive sentence is a lot more helpful for people who get hung up on some of the terms that we tend to use in our field. Patriarchy too.
I really love that because I think, I know at Forge, we used to avoid certain language, certain words. Like we used to avoid the word oppression because oppression is a really useful word. I mean, it means a lot of things, but it could be weaponized against people. Same with patriarchy, same with toxic masculinity. And so, what you just said about like using plain language, describing what the behaviors are, describing what it means, sometimes takes away that weaponizing kind of punitiveness about what's going on. So this brings us to something that you and I kind of chatted about the other day, and it kind of relates to the whole concept of masculinity and what does that mean, and what does it mean in our current culture. And we ended up talking about drag queen story hours. Um, and so you told a couple of stories around drag queen story hours, and I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about the recent things that have happened in your community and how it does or doesn't relate to those concepts.
So recently in a city near me, near Harrisburg, so in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, there was a drag story hour that was scheduled at a library, a public library, and there was the level of negative um, feedback and really transphobic, homophobic um, messages were even being echoed by like local elected officials, and it wasn't a good situation. And um, eventually, the event was canceled. The library had to cancel the event because of um, a a bomb threat, being worried about suspicious packages and things. So just a really not good situation. Yeah, I think so many things are wrapped up in this. Just our ideas of safety, myths about sexual violence and queer and trans people. Um, there are just these wrong messages that um, being around drag performers is something that is bad or violent for children. Yeah, it just makes me think about like what is safety, and how gender is, and just wrong ideas about gender and sexuality are wrapped up in that. I don't know. I think about the same thing about bathrooms. I was just having this conversation where, um, people who are being really transphobic and are out there saying that trans people essentially shouldn't use bathrooms is what really it comes down to, in public. And I'm like, so is the thing that you're saying that there are all these people out there who want to hurt children, and the one thing that is stopping them from doing that is a stick figure of a person with a dress on a door? It doesn't track in any way for me. It's not helping anybody. And of course, it's trans people, in fact, um, who are experiencing the most victimization in these gender segregated spaces. So, I mean, there's a lot of directions we can go with this, but the one thing that I kept coming back to was, just these wrong ideas about gender, these wrong ideas about sexuality, these wrong ideas about violence, come to these just actually absurd places.
I've thought a lot about drag queen story hours, but one of the things that you just said reminds me of like, who goes to the story hours? There are kids that are mostly cisgender kids, mostly non-trans kids, and they learn about healthy relationships. They learn about these stories that get read are like, they're not, over the top stories. They're just really cool stories usually of healthy relationships and dynamics. And so it's really taking away the opportunities for young boys and young girls and young trans people to learn about some of those things because we're shutting those events down. So, it's not just a trans thing, it's a how does education get stopped when we stop that event, which is it's just sad.
If you can't talk about these things in your community, how are survivors going to even know that you're there to help them?
So that brings us up to a really good thing about talking about the partnership between NSVRC and Men Healing. So there's a webinar series going on. Tell us about what's happening because it's really, really cool.
Yeah, thanks for asking that. This is something that's really exciting. So, um, Men Healing and the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center, or BARC, are doing a webinar series with us. Yeah, so we're kind of in the middle of it, and it's this monthly webinar on a variety of different topics that relate to men as survivors, and how to work with men. And there's been great interest in the field. So I don't know. As someone who is here working at NSVRC, one of the things that I'm thinking about always is just how to connect people to resources, how to connect advocates who are working at community-based victim service organizations, how to get them connected to resources. Sometimes those are the resources that we create at NSVRC. But often they're just resources that we become aware of. So Men Healing has so many. There's the YouTube videos. I don't know what they're called now, but I know I've sent that playlist to people that has to do with like healing skills. And the days of recovery and weekends of recovery. These are all great resources for the people that I'm trying to get resources to. We've got this 6-session webinar series. They're all recorded in English and Spanish. So if people want to catch up on those, there's a YouTube playlist, and all of those recordings will also be available on our website, nsvrc.org. There's been great interest. I think people are really interested in this topic of working with men, and I'm fascinated by that. I think because something that we talk about is, there's this maybe these two seemingly contradictory realities. One is that advocates have the training and skills to work with survivors, right? That's true. And at the same time, if you're not working with men, or if you or your organization have biases that men are only perpetrators and not survivors, then those can be barriers that we put up and stop men from getting services. So it's kind of like, I think sometimes people just need to be assured that, like, yeah, you do have the skills to work with men, but also, and like, maybe you need to do some specific thinking around what things might come up when you're working with men. And we know that Men Healing has a lot of great insight into doing that, into some of the things that are specific and that are kind of tried and true through Men Healing's weekends of recovery, especially, that we're glad to bring to our field and help people be skilled and resourced, and also to feel more confident, hopefully. In knowing that, like, they do know things, and they have a lot to offer survivors in their community. That's why they're there. So
and that is such a great point, because I think that a lot of times people just forget that they know how to do their job. So it's like, if you're an advocate, you gotta do your job as an advocate. So don't forget that, right? Even though you're working with a male survivor, that you may not be as familiar with working with men, but that's okay. You can still do your job that you know how to do really well. And then there's other resources that you can add to your pool of knowledge.
And also, I should say too, I mentioned nsvrc.org is our website. There's a whole online toolkit on working with men on there. So
I'm wondering if we could kind of scroll down to what the tagline is for this podcast series, which is really about let's listen, let's learn, and let's heal. And that can mean so many things to so many different people. So when you hear those phrases, so let's listen, let's learn, let's heal, what does that mean to you? How do you think that applies to the work with men and male survivors?
Yeah, I mean, the word that I'm immediately drawn to is heal. And I know that, I've heard people really bristle against this concept and say, that, or at least how I understand what some people I've listened to have said, is that it's like kind of not a real concept, that like you don't get all the way better. It's this process. But to me, that's not what the word means at all. It doesn't mean that you reach an endpoint, I don't think. I really like the framework of thinking about healing, in part because I think it shifts the conversation around response to sexual violence away from a crime sort of conversation. Um, I'm not saying that we shouldn't think of sexual assault as a crime, because of course it is, and that's important. But when we only think of those solutions as like the totality of what someone could access, I think that's really bad, and it's in fact stops people from getting any kind of help, because they might be thinking like, I don't want to interact with that system, or I don't want the person who hurt me to interact with that system. I just want it to stop, and I want some help making sense of it. That might not resonate with everyone, but it does resonate, I think, with a lot of people. And I think that based on some things that I've been listening to and learning from what people say, right, to use those other words in this tagline. So I think when we talk about healing, I think that helps shift to just broader possibilities. And I also really like that, let's is, let us. So that's, implying that there's a community, right? That there's, these aren't like individual journeys that you have to go on alone.
That is fantastic too. About I mean, I've said those words dozens of times now, but you're right. Let's is an us piece. And that is so important, that we don't heal alone. We don't process alone. It's a together thing. And we can't do it. None of us can do this work by ourselves, whether it's our own healing work or it's the work that we do with clients or survivors. So thank you for pointing that out, that it's an us, not a you or a me. It's a we. Are there other things that you'd like to share that we haven't talked about in our last few minutes?
I do hope that people check out the webinar series and the other resources that we have available. I hope people do contact the NSVRC if there's anything that we can support you in doing. So at resources at nsvrc-respecttogether.org. If we don't have a resource that we've made, we're really good at going and finding stuff that exists out there.
Thank you for all of your knowledge and thoughtfulness, and I always really appreciate how reflective you are, and how you use simple and plain language, which is really, really good. And I mean that as a total compliment, because I think it really helps people understand things that might be a little bit complicated or difficult. So thank you very much for sharing all that you shared today and for all the work that you do.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Just Healing. Join us for new episodes throughout 2024, where we will continue to spread messages of hope and healing, and welcome Just Healing's two other new co-hosts, Dr. Greg Kaysen and Jace Barron. It's going to be an exciting year. And remember, you are worthy, you are loved. Trauma doesn't define any of us. Healing is possible, and it's a collective journey. This podcast was produced by Dr. Deborah and me, Michael Munson, in collaboration with Men Healing, a national nonprofit organization dedicated to helping provide accessible resources and community for any male or masculine identifying individual who has experienced sexual harm. You can donate, check out our healing events, videos, and other resources at menhealing.org. If you or someone you know has been a victim of or experienced sexual harm and you need to talk to someone, RAIN can help. Call their National Sexual Assault Hotline to speak with a trained staff member who can provide you with confidential crisis support. It's free, it's confidential, and it's available 24/7. You can call 1-800-656-4673, or you can go to their web-based chat support. You can reach it at hotline.rain.org. That's HOTLINE.RAIN.org. INN.org.